The Pacific Theater, 1942 to 1945. Combat in the Pacific Islands presented a distinctly challenging environment for soldiers. Thick, often impenetrable jungle foliage reduced visibility and engagement distances, frequently forcing encounters to occur within 30 yards or less. In response to these conditions, the United States Marine Corps introduced a weapon that would disrupt long-standing Japanese assumptions about battlefield dynamics, the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Though detailed accounts of its deployment in specific battles are scarce, the inclusion of the Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 in Marine inventories across the Pacific Campaign provided a tactical advantage unforeseen by Japanese planners. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Army had meticulously prepared for potential conflicts with Western powers. Their military manuals and training emphasized responses to rifles used by the British, machine guns of the Americans, French mortars, and Soviet submachine guns. Shotguns, regarded by Japanese military doctrine as hunting implements rather than combat tools, were largely absent from these preparations. This omission would become a critical vulnerability as American forces fielded roughly 25,000 Model 97 shotguns alongside 60,000 to 80,000 Model 12s during World War II. By 1942, Japanese military strategy relied heavily on the concept of spiritual and moral superiority to offset material deficiencies. This approach was grounded not in mere rhetoric, but in a practical acknowledgement of Japan's industrial limitations. In 1 year, Japan produced less steel than the United States manufactured in a single month. Consequently, Japanese doctrine sought to enhance the individual combat effectiveness of soldiers, emphasizing skill, discipline, and fighting spirit over technological reliance. The tactical embodiment of this philosophy was the nighttime infiltration attack, followed by intense hand-to-hand combat using rifles and bayonets. Japanese infantry trained extensively in these methods, which had proven effective against Chinese forces, British units in Malaya, and American defenders in the Philippines. The typical engagement unfolded predictably. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese soldiers would penetrate enemy lines, then overpower defenders at close quarters, relying on their superior melee skills. The introduction of American shotguns fundamentally undermined this doctrine. At distances where Japanese soldiers expected to dominate, a Marine armed with a Winchester Model 1897 could discharge 6 rounds of 000 buckshot in roughly 2 seconds, exploiting the weapon's slam-fire mechanism. The psychological and physical impact of such firepower in confined jungle spaces rendered traditional Japanese infiltration tactics far less effective, forcing adaptations that the Imperial Army had not anticipated. In effect, the shotgun became a disruptive force on the Pacific battlefield, reshaping the nature of close-quarters combat and highlighting the intersection of industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, and terrain in modern warfare. In close-range jungle combat, the shotgun offered a brutal kind of certainty. Each shell released 9 large buckshot pellets, spreading outward in a widening cone that dramatically reduced the chance of a miss when visibility was limited by thick vegetation. In environments where targets appeared suddenly and at short distances, this wide dispersal proved especially valuable. Among the weapons carried by U.S. Marines in the early stages of the Pacific War, the Winchester Model 1897 occupied a distinctive role. Originally conceived by legendary firearms designer John Moses Browning, the shotgun underwent decades of refinement during its long production life. By the time it reached military service, it had become a rugged and reliable tool, suited for harsh field conditions. The military configuration of the Model 97 differed significantly from its civilian counterpart. It was equipped with a shortened 20-inch barrel, a ventilated metal heat shield to protect the shooter's hands during sustained fire, and a bayonet mount compatible with the M1917 sword bayonet. One of its most controversial and defining characteristics was the absence of a trigger disconnector. This allowed the weapon to fire repeatedly as long as the trigger was held down and the pump was cycled, a feature that enabled extremely rapid fire in close engagements. Winchester later introduced the Model 1912, commonly known as the Model 12, as an evolutionary step forward. Designed by company engineer Thomas Crossley Johnson, it incorporated an internal hammer system that greatly reduced the risk of accidental discharge. This improvement made the weapon safer to handle under stress. By the middle of World War II, particularly around 1943, the Model 12 began replacing the older Model 97 within Marine units, though both shotguns continued to see service until the war's end. While procurement documents confirm consistent production and distribution, precise figures detailing their battlefield deployment were never formally recorded. Just as critical as the shotgun itself was the ammunition it fired. Standard 12-gauge 000 buckshot loads contained 9 pellets, each weighing approximately 53.8 grains and measuring just over 8.3 millimeters in diameter. When fired, the pattern expanded in a predictable way, roughly 10 inches across at 10 yards, doubling to 20 inches at 20 yards, and spreading to around 30 inches at 30 yards. In jungle fighting, where lines of sight rarely extended beyond 30 yards, this pattern helped offset the difficulty of precise aiming amid tangled foliage and poor lighting. The campaign for Guadalcanal, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, marked the first major American offensive against Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater. Marines of the 1st Division came ashore carrying a mix of infantry weapons, including a limited number of shotguns. However, official battle documentation does not provide exact counts or details regarding how widely shotguns were issued or used during the landings. One of the most well-known engagements of the campaign occurred on August 21, 1942, along what was initially called the Tanaru River, but was in fact Alligator Creek. In this battle, a Japanese detachment of 917 men under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki launched a frontal assault and was almost entirely destroyed, suffering approximately 789 fatalities. Although this clash is frequently cited in accounts of jungle combat, contemporary sources overwhelmingly credit the devastating outcome to heavy weapons, specifically Browning M1917 water-cooled machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister ammunition. Shotguns, while present, receive only minimal mention in primary records of the battle. Throughout the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign, Marine shotguns were typically assigned to specialized roles rather than massed combat use. They were commonly employed for nighttime perimeter defense and jungle patrols, where sudden, close-range encounters were most likely. Period photographs show patrol point men armed with Winchester shotguns positioned at the front of columns to react instantly to ambushes in the dense undergrowth. Even so, official after-action reports continued to emphasize rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery as the decisive tools of combat. The tropical environment itself posed serious challenges to shotgun effectiveness. The extreme humidity of the Solomon Islands proved especially problematic for ammunition. At the time, standard shotgun shells used paper hulls, which readily absorbed moisture from the air. In the near-constant damp conditions of the jungle, these shells would swell, sometimes to the point where they could no longer be chambered. Marines reported that shells which functioned perfectly in dry conditions became unusable after prolonged exposure to humidity. In severe cases, swollen shells had to be forced into the chamber with tools, an obviously impractical solution in the midst of combat. This ammunition failure significantly reduced the reliability of shotguns and undermined their tactical value during much of the Pacific Campaign. The issue persisted for years and was not fully resolved until late in the war. On March 29, 1945, the U.S. military officially adopted an all-brass shotgun cartridge designed specifically for tropical conditions. Designated as the 12-gauge M19 00 Buck brass shell, this new ammunition eliminated the moisture absorption problem entirely, restoring confidence in shotgun performance. By then, however, the shotgun's role in the Pacific had already been shaped as much by environmental limitations as by its fearsome close-range power. During the final months of World War II, the introduction of moisture-resistant brass-cased shotgun shells markedly improved the reliability of these firearms in combat. The relatively late arrival of this ammunition explains why shotguns are seldom highlighted in the memoirs of veterans who served in the Pacific Theater. Earlier in the war, shortages and logistical issues with shotgun shells had significantly restricted their operational utility. The U.S. military formalized instruction on shotgun use through Technical Manual TM 9-285, first issued on September 21, 1942. This manual provided detailed guidance on several models, including the Winchester 9-7 and 12, Remington 11, Stevens 520 and 620, and the Ithaca 37. Marine personnel received training at key facilities such as Camp Pendleton in California, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and Parris Island in South Carolina. Instruction emphasized tactical deployment in various scenarios, securing points during patrols, rapid response in nocturnal defensive actions, clearing caves and bunkers, and maintaining control of prisoners. Marines were taught the distinctive slam-fire capability of the Winchester Model 9-7, though instructors cautioned against excessive reliance due to the risks of rapid ammunition depletion and barrel overheating. Organizationally, the Marine Corps' Table of Organization E-100, effective in 1943, allotted 306 shotguns per division. These firearms were primarily assigned to military police units, pioneer battalions, and select rifle squads tasked with specialized operations. Consequently, while shotguns were present in every significant Marine campaign, they accounted for less than 2% of a division's total small arms inventory. Interestingly, historical records show that Japanese forces never lodged formal complaints regarding the American use of shotguns. This stands in stark contrast to Germany's formal protest in September 1918 during World War I, which claimed that shotguns caused undue suffering and even threatened American captives armed with them. Japanese military documents captured during and after the war make no mention of the need for specific countermeasures against shotguns. Japanese tactical manuals and planning emphasized countering American machine guns, artillery, and flamethrowers, but shotgun fire did not merit special attention. The absence of formal Japanese acknowledgement suggests that while individual soldiers undoubtedly encountered shotgun fire in combat, these weapons did not exert a level of tactical influence sufficient to provoke official concern. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers reflect a similar pattern. Discussions highlighted American material advantages, superior firepower, and effective combined arms operations, yet shotguns were rarely cited as particularly threatening. This contrasts sharply with the extensive Japanese documentation addressing countermeasures for flamethrowers, which prompted deliberate tactical adaptations. From 1942 to 1945, the New Guinea campaign tested both U.S. Army and Marine Corps units in some of the most formidable terrain of the Second World War. Drawing from lessons learned by Marines at Guadalcanal, the 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions requested shotguns for jungle operations. On paper, the dense, visibility-limited jungles of New Guinea appeared ideal for these weapons, yet the same ammunition issues that had plagued Marines in the Solomon Islands were even more severe in the New Guinea highlands. Constant rainfall, numerous river crossings, and oppressive humidity rendered paper-hulled shotgun shells highly unreliable. As a result, many Army units that had requested shotguns opted to leave them in rear areas, favoring instead M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. The experience highlighted a fundamental lesson. A weapon's theoretical effectiveness did not always translate to real-world combat performance. Shotguns performed well in training scenarios and controlled exercises, but the unforgiving conditions of jungle warfare exposed limitations that would not be fully resolved until the introduction of brass ammunition in 1945.
Over time, Marine units refined specific tactics for shotgun use in combat. The weapons proved most practical in three main roles: point security during patrols, defending perimeters against enemy infiltration, and overseeing prisoners. For patrol missions, designated shotgun bearers would take lead positions, ready to respond immediately to ambushes with widespread, devastating fire. The dispersal pattern of buckshot allowed them to suppress multiple enemy positions at once, enabling patrol units to maneuver while maintaining fire dominance. This tactic required intensive coordination and trust, as the shotgunner often operated ahead of mutual support lines. Another specialized application involved nighttime perimeter defense. Marines stationed shotgun operators at probable infiltration routes, taking advantage of the weapon's wide shot pattern to compensate for low visibility. The unmistakable sound of pumping a shotgun also served as both a warning signal and a psychological deterrent to approaching enemies. However, due to limited ammunition capacity, shotgun teams always required immediate rifle support once engaged. During the October 1944 return to the Philippines, the 6th Army requested a significant allocation of shotguns for anticipated urban combat in Manila. In practice, Marine involvement in the Philippine ground campaign was limited, mainly restricted to artillery and air support roles. The Army's 37th Infantry Division, which conducted most of the street-to-street fighting, employed shotguns in close-quarters engagements, though post-battle reports emphasized flamethrowers and demolition charges as the primary tools for neutralizing fortified Japanese positions. Urban combat highlighted both the strengths and weaknesses of shotguns. They were highly effective in sudden, close encounters, but their advantages diminished when defenders fortified positions to prevent direct access. The February 1945 invasion of Iwo Jima theoretically allocated 918 shotguns across 3 Marine divisions. Yet the island's volcanic ash, extensive tunnel networks, and heavily fortified enemy positions limited the practical impact of these weapons. Iconic moments, such as the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi, were achieved after flamethrower and demolition teams cleared Japanese defenses, rather than through shotgun assaults. Marines relied heavily on M2-2 flamethrowers and specialized flame techs to clear caves and fortified positions, projecting burning fuel up to 40 yards, well beyond the effective range of a shotgun.
Of the roughly 26,000 American casualties on Iwo Jima, historical records do not attribute any directly to the absence or failure of shotguns. The late arrival of brass ammunition further reduced the effectiveness of shotguns during the battle. M19 brass shells only reached certain units in late March 1945, after combat operations had ended. Until that time, Marines contended with swollen, unreliable paper shells, severely restricting the tactical use of shotguns even in one of the Pacific War's most intense and strategically critical engagements. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945, represented a culmination of tactical lessons accumulated throughout the Pacific theater. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions were officially allocated 612 shotguns, complete with reliable brass ammunition, yet the realities of the battlefield severely limited opportunities for their deployment. Much of the fighting unfolded across open terrain dominated by heavily fortified Japanese positions, reducing the practicality of shotguns in direct engagements. The defending Japanese 32nd Army had moved away from the massed banzai assaults seen in earlier campaigns, instead relying on a defense-in-depth strategy. Their forces occupied a series of fortified positions along the Shuri Line, utilizing bunkers, caves, and interconnected defensive works that forced American troops to engage at long distances. Under these conditions, Marines predominantly employed combined arms tactics, coordinating closely with armored units, including flamethrower-equipped tanks, which provided essential support in clearing fortified positions. Shotguns were mostly reserved for the final stage of clearing operations, when small Marine squads methodically removed the remaining Japanese defenders from captured structures. Additionally, military police units used shotguns to manage the large civilian population movements, though these roles represented a minor portion of overall combat operations. Despite the wealth of World War II documentation, records detailing the use of shotguns in actual combat are surprisingly sparse. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project houses thousands of interviews with Pacific War veterans, yet mentions of shotguns appear infrequently. Similarly, the National Museum of the Pacific War contains over 4,000 oral histories, but detailed accounts of shotgun use are virtually non-existent. Notably, Eugene Sledge's memoir, With the Old Breed, widely regarded as a premier first-hand account of the Pacific War, makes no reference to shotguns, despite his extensive service in rifle companies at Peleliu and Okinawa. Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow also omits discussion of shotguns, even though he served with the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal. These omissions suggest that shotguns were peripheral rather than central to the combat experience of Marines. The limited references that do exist indicate that shotguns were useful in specialized circumstances, such as night security and close-range ambushes, but rifles, machine guns, and mortars remained decisive in determining battle outcomes.
Official records reinforce this assessment. Shotguns constituted less than 2% of the armament within a division, confirming their marginal role in large-scale combat. American industry, however, produced significant numbers of military shotguns during the war. Winchester alone manufactured roughly 25,000 Model 97s and between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 12s for military contracts, while Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca supplied additional thousands. This production capacity highlighted the United States' industrial strength, but did not necessarily correspond to frontline use. Many shotguns were allocated to training installations, security details in rear areas, and military police operations. They were also deployed on Navy vessels for boarding parties and security duties, and at air bases for perimeter defense. These essential yet non-combat functions absorbed much of the total output. The disparity between production and combat usage underscores that although it was technically feasible to equip every Marine squad with a shotgun, practical challenges such as ammunition supply, tactical restrictions, and doctrinal limitations kept most shotguns in secondary roles. They were specialized instruments rather than primary weapons of war. Comparing their use with other weapons illustrates this point. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1943, was consistently employed in cave and bunker clearing operations, with Marines at Iwo Jima reportedly using 27,000 gallons of fuel under well-documented operational records. In contrast, there is a striking lack of documentation regarding shotgun ammunition expenditure. Similarly, the Browning automatic rifle, BAR, became the backbone of the Marine Rifle Squad's firepower, with 3 BAR teams standard in every squad by 1944, supported by detailed training regimens and tactical doctrine.
shotguns never achieved such doctrinal integration or widespread documentation in combat. In summary, while the military shotgun was available in significant numbers and found selective applications, it remained largely on the periphery of frontline combat in the Pacific. Its use was situational, complementing primary weapons rather than shaping the course of battles, and its historical footprint in veteran accounts and official records reflects a modest, specialized role rather than a central one. Although the M1918 Browning machine gun was not exceedingly common, it generated considerably more first-hand combat documentation than shotguns. Veterans frequently recount detailed episodes involving the Browning, including the number of rounds fired, specific tactical uses, and its overall battlefield influence. In contrast, comparable records regarding shotguns are scarce, indicating that despite their official authorization and the quantities produced, their actual deployment in combat remained marginal.
The divergence between the lore surrounding shotguns and the historical record reflects a broader trend in World War II historiography. Cultural narratives, particularly those shaped by movies and sensationalized retellings, have often amplified the significance of certain weapons beyond what contemporary accounts support. The shotgun, with its visually striking appearance and devastating performance in close quarters, naturally lent itself to this type of exaggeration. In the years following the war, Hollywood frequently depicted Marines clearing enemy positions using shotguns, creating enduring public images that primary documents seldom confirm. These portrayals, reinforced by video games and popular historical accounts, cemented the shotgun's reputation as a quintessential weapon of the Pacific theater. Yet, the historical record suggests that these depictions overstate its combat role. In reality, shotguns were mostly supplementary tools, valued in specific scenarios, but far from decisive in determining battle outcomes. The limited first-hand testimonies from veterans provide a clearer picture of their actual use. Marines who carried shotguns described them as effective in narrowly defined circumstances, but cumbersome for routine operations. Factors such as weight, restricted ammunition capacity, and their specialized function meant that conventional rifles were generally favored. One Marine, interviewed in 1985, recalled carrying a Model 97 along Guadalcanal. It proved useful for night watches and navigating dense jungle paths, yet it was inadequate for long-range engagements. His recollection underscores the weapon's limitations and the practical considerations influencing combat decisions. Another account, from a member of the 2nd Marine Division, highlighted how shotguns were distributed. While official policy aimed for each squad to have one, in practice many remained stored with company-level equipment due to their specialized nature. This anecdote illustrates the gap between formal authorization and actual battlefield application.
In March 1945, the introduction of brass-cased M19 ammunition addressed the persistent moisture-related issues that had hindered shotgun reliability throughout the Pacific campaigns. However, this improvement came too late to meaningfully influence combat operations. By that time, major engagements such as the battles for Iwo Jima were concluded, the invasion of Okinawa was imminent, and the Philippines campaign had largely wrapped up. Though the new ammunition proved useful for occupation duties and the anticipated invasion of Japan, those plans were rendered moot by the deployment of atomic bombs, leaving the combat efficacy of brass-cased shotguns largely untested. In sum, while shotguns were present in the Pacific and occasionally effective in niche applications, they never approached the strategic or tactical importance of rifles, machine guns, mortars, or flamethrowers. Their post-war reputation, bolstered by popular culture, reflects narrative and visual appeal rather than battlefield prevalence, highlighting the contrast between enduring myth and operational reality. Post-war assessments indicated that the introduction of brass shotgun ammunition could have significantly enhanced the weapon's performance if it had been available earlier in the conflict. Nevertheless, such counterfactual reasoning cannot alter the established historical record. Throughout the majority of the Pacific War, shotguns were hampered by severe ammunition reliability issues, which greatly constrained their operational effectiveness. Interestingly, the Japanese military did not develop any dedicated strategies specifically to counter shotguns. In contrast, they implemented detailed and deliberate countermeasures against other American weapon systems, measures that clearly influenced battlefield outcomes. Japanese soldiers constructed overhead shelters to reduce mortar effectiveness, built spider holes to impede tanks, and employed reverse slope defenses to mitigate naval gunfire. The absence of comparable anti-shotgun tactics strongly implies that shotguns never exerted a meaningful tactical influence on Japanese operations. During the Pacific campaigns, Japanese adaptations focused on neutralizing the broad technological and material advantages of American forces through careful use of terrain and layered defensive positions. Examples include the transition from shoreline fortifications to inland strongpoints, the creation of extensive interlinked tunnel networks, and the eventual abandonment of banzai charges, all aimed at countering general American firepower rather than any single weapon like the shotgun.
After the war, Japanese military analyses examined U.S. tactics and armaments in great detail, yet shotguns were barely mentioned. These studies emphasized artillery coordination, naval gunfire support, and combined arms operations between infantry and armored units. The lack of references to shotguns in otherwise comprehensive reviews strongly suggests that they held minimal significance in Japanese tactical considerations. One of the clearest indicators of the shotgun's limited impact is the absence of quantitative data. World War II generated vast amounts of operational statistics, including ammunition expenditure, casualty records, and effectiveness studies for various weapons. Yet no reliable figures exist linking shotgun usage to enemy losses or tactical outcomes. The operational research divisions, which meticulously measured weapon performance during the war, produced in-depth reports on artillery, mortars, and small arms, analyzing hit probabilities, casualty ratios, and ammunition efficiency. Comparable analyses for shotguns are missing, indicating that their employment in combat was too sporadic to produce meaningful statistical insights. Even informal estimates are lacking. Veterans frequently recall the number of rifle rounds fired, grenades thrown, or mortar shells expended, but accounts of shotgun usage are rare in memoirs, interviews, or unit histories. This absence of data suggests that, despite being issued to Marine units, shotguns played only a peripheral role in frontline operations. Training programs, however, created expectations that combat would feature extensive shotgun use. Marines were instructed in slam-fire techniques, practiced jungle engagements, and qualified with both buckshot and slug ammunition. This regimen implied that shotguns would be central to combat activities. In reality, battlefield conditions differed dramatically from these training exercises. Environments like Guadalcanal or volcanic ash-covered islands presented challenges far removed from the controlled settings of Camp Pendleton. Training targets did not return fire, and engagements rarely occurred at the short distances emphasized in exercises. The disconnect between training emphasis and actual deployment mirrored other World War II phenomena, such as the extensive time devoted to bayonet instruction despite limited bayonet encounters, or chemical warfare preparations for attacks that never materialized. Logistical constraints further limited shotgun employment. A single 12-gauge shell weighed roughly twice as much as a standard rifle cartridge and required 3 times the storage space. Within the same weight and volume, a Marine could carry up to 80 rifle rounds but only 36 shotgun shells. Supply priorities on landing craft and ships favored rifle ammunition, machine gun belts, and mortar shells, while specialized shotgun rounds were treated as lower priority. The limited carrying capacity of amphibious vessels meant that every box of ammunition required careful justification. Consequently, even when shotguns were assigned specific roles, their ammunition received secondary consideration compared to more versatile general-purpose munitions. Despite the availability of shotguns, logistical constraints severely limited their operational impact. Ammunition supplies were scarce, and veterans recall receiving only a handful of shell boxes, sometimes just 1 or 2, intended to last through entire missions.
This shortage naturally discouraged widespread use, keeping the shotgun's battlefield influence far below what its theoretical capabilities might have suggested. Prior to the Manila and Naha City operations, military planners anticipated that shotguns would excel in dense urban environments, prompting formal requests for higher allocations. The confined layouts, short engagement distances, and frequent need to clear rooms appeared to make these weapons particularly well-suited for urban combat scenarios. Yet, the reality of fighting in city streets exposed significant limitations. Japanese defenders meticulously established lethal zones and fortified positions that kept American troops at ranges beyond the effective reach of shotguns. Barricades, interlocking fields of fire, and numerous booby traps consistently prevented close-quarter engagement. Consequently, the immense firepower of the shotgun, so theoretically ideal for street-to-street combat, proved largely irrelevant, as Marines were rarely able to approach close enough to utilize it effectively. In situations where close-quarters combat did occur, veterans report relying more heavily on grenades, Thompson submachine guns, and flamethrowers. These alternatives provided comparable short-range lethality while offering far greater operational flexibility. The Thompson, in particular, with its 30-round magazine, offered a decisive advantage over the standard 6-round shotgun, especially in sustained firefights. Although shotguns had minimal influence on Japanese tactical thinking, they assumed a disproportionately prominent role in American military culture. The image of a Marine wielding a trench gun to sweep through enemy positions became emblematic, despite the sparse historical evidence supporting widespread combat use. This cultural resonance outstripped the weapon's actual performance on the battlefield. The shotgun came to symbolize American practicality, repurposing hunting tools for military applications in contrast to European conventions. This narrative reinforced a self-image of ingenuity and resourcefulness, appealing to perceptions of the United States as a nation unbound by traditional military norms. In contrast, Japanese military doctrine centered on rifles, machine guns, and artillery, and shotguns never factored into their strategic or tactical frameworks. While some accounts suggest that this cultural blind spot left Japanese forces unprepared, historical records indicate that the real issue was the limited employment of shotguns, not doctrinal oversight. The story of the shotgun underscores the complex interplay between technology and military doctrine. While shotguns were designed to deliver devastating effects at close range with wide shot patterns ideal for jungle and confined combat, their effective use depended on very specific tactical circumstances that rarely manifested in real operations. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Marine doctrine evolved to integrate new weapons and tactics, but shotguns never became a central element of squad-level strategy. They remained niche tools for particular situations rather than core components of combat firepower. This marginalization reflected practical experience rather than any inherent deficiency in the weapon itself. By contrast, other weapons demonstrated successful integration and extensive doctrinal development. The bar, for example, became a standard part of squad tactics with detailed guidelines for use, while flamethrowers revolutionized bunker clearing operations and inspired extensive tactical manuals. Shotguns, despite their theoretical potential, never prompted such formal doctrinal expansion. Administrative records provide further insight into shotgun utilization. Requisitions, maintenance logs, and replacement forms all document patterns of weapon use. Rifle and machine gun parts appear frequently, reflecting heavy and sustained field use, whereas shotgun parts requests were infrequent, indicating limited wear and operational employment. Armorer reports from Marine divisions corroborate this pattern. Rifles and machine guns required constant upkeep due to repeated combat use, while shotguns mostly needed attention for cleaning and minor corrosion after storage rather than actual firing. Ammunition requisition data mirrors these trends. Divisions routinely requested millions of rifle rounds and hundreds of thousands of machine gun cartridges for combat operations, while shotgun shell orders remained modest, often intended for training rather than frontline consumption. Taken together, administrative records and veteran testimony paint a consistent picture. Shotguns were available and theoretically powerful, but in practice, most spent more time in storage than in active combat, their role remaining peripheral rather than central to the Marine Corps' tactical arsenal. Examining the experiences of other nations offers valuable insight into the role of shotguns in military operations and provides a benchmark for assessing American practices. During World War II, British and Australian units operating in the Pacific Theater relied predominantly on rifles and submachine guns for jungle combat, with shotguns playing at most a peripheral role. Their ability to achieve operational success without widespread shotgun deployment suggests that these weapons were not a critical factor in combat effectiveness under Pacific conditions. Similarly, the Soviet military, which confronted a wide spectrum of combat environments, from urban warfare in Stalingrad to rural engagements across the Kursk region, never incorporated combat shotguns into their standard arsenal, despite producing vast quantities of small arms. Chinese forces, facing persistent close-quarters combat during the Sino-Japanese War, also operated without shotguns, even when the tactical situation demanded highly effective short-range weapons. Taken together, these international examples indicate that shotguns represented one of many tactical possibilities rather than a decisive instrument of war. The evidence shows that multiple nations accomplished comparable operational results through different combinations of firearms, suggesting that the tactical influence of shotguns remained limited, regardless of the scale of American production. Following World War II, U.S. military planners conducted extensive evaluations of wartime weaponry to determine priorities for future development. The Army's Infantry Board, in particular, systematically reviewed performance data and concluded that rifles, machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles warranted ongoing investment and modernization. In contrast, shotguns received little attention, signaling that their battlefield contribution during the conflict did not justify significant post-war allocation of resources. During the Korean War, close-quarters engagements were common, yet shotguns were employed sparingly. Marines on patrol predominantly carried M1 Garands, BARs, and carbines, reserving shotguns for very specific situations rather than routine operations. The choices made by veterans who had fought across the Pacific reflect a practical assessment of the weapon's real-world effectiveness versus theoretical advantages. In Vietnam, shotguns saw a resurgence, particularly in the form of modified commercial models suited for dense jungle patrols. Even in this context, however, they remained specialized tools, assigned primarily to point men, tunnel rats, and other troops performing highly targeted roles, rather than standard-issue arms for general infantry. Modern military doctrine continues this trend, positioning shotguns for specialized missions rather than as a core element of general combat strategy. Historical records further clarify the impact of American shotguns on Japanese forces during World War II. Although shotgun units were integrated into Marine formations throughout the Pacific Campaign, operational use was constrained by logistical issues, tactical limitations, and prevailing doctrinal preferences. The late introduction of brass shell ammunition in March 1945 occurred too late to significantly alter battlefield outcomes. Japanese forces did not implement countermeasures specifically targeting shotguns, reflecting their negligible influence on combat decisions. The absence of references to shotguns in Japanese training manuals, operational reports, or post-war analyses underscores their marginal role in shaping the results of engagements. In conclusion, both international comparisons and detailed historical records demonstrate that while shotguns were a part of the U.S. arsenal, they never constituted a decisive weapon. Their utility remained situational, shaped by environmental factors, doctrinal priorities, and logistical constraints. Across multiple conflicts, nations achieved success using alternative weapon systems, reinforcing the understanding that shotguns were one tactical option among many, rather than a cornerstone of military capability. The evolution of Japanese infantry tactics during the Pacific War was shaped by the overall firepower of U.S. forces rather than by any single weapon system, such as the shotgun. Although shotguns were officially issued in considerable numbers, a detailed examination of their deployment reveals a notable divergence between their theoretical utility and their practical use in combat. Marine divisions were formally allotted approximately 306 shotguns each, yet most of these firearms were relegated to secondary responsibilities. They frequently served in training exercises, guard duties, and rear area security rather than on the front lines. Personal accounts from veterans that reference shotguns generally describe them as situationally advantageous but not essential to the broader conduct of battle. Their role was supplementary rather than decisive. The perception of shotguns in the Pacific theater has often been magnified beyond their historical significance. Cultural depictions and wartime anecdotes have elevated these weapons to near legendary status, despite limited primary documentation supporting the idea that they altered battle outcomes in any major way. In reality, rifles, machine guns, mortars, and flamethrowers were the primary instruments of combat success, shaping engagements and determining victory. Shotguns, by contrast, were specialized tools with narrow tactical niches. Their story illustrates a broader principle. The presence of an advanced or theoretically powerful weapon does not automatically translate to meaningful battlefield influence. Operational integration through doctrine, logistics, and training is critical for a weapon to achieve actual effectiveness. While shotguns had certain inherent advantages, practical limitations restricted their widespread use. Japanese forces did not develop specific countermeasures, but this was not a critical oversight. In practice, shotguns never reached a level of tactical significance that would have made a tailored response necessary. The Japanese military's strategic attention remained rightly focused on the weapons that genuinely shaped the outcome of the war, including artillery, naval gunfire, air power, and flamethrowers. The U.S. capacity to mass-produce shotguns demonstrated remarkable industrial strength, yet this production prowess did not equate directly to battlefield dominance. The sheer availability of weapons does not guarantee their effective application, particularly in the challenging conditions of Pacific combat. This disconnect between production and practical employment underscores that industrial output, while impressive, does not inherently confer a tactical advantage. Historical evidence suggests that encounters between Japanese infantry and American shotguns were limited and highly situational. When they did occur, shotguns were occasionally effective, particularly in close-quarters engagements, but they did not exert the decisive influence often attributed to them in popular narratives. Japanese troops were indeed unprepared for the appearance of shotguns, but this lack of preparation had minimal effect on operational outcomes because the weapon's overall impact was marginal. Documentary sources, including unit tables, training manuals, and production figures, confirm the presence of shotguns within U.S. Marine formations. However, the scarcity of detailed combat reports, statistical analyses, and recorded Japanese adaptations indicates that their actual use in major engagements was sporadic. Veteran testimonies consistently portray shotguns as specialized implements for limited situations, rather than primary tools capable of shaping battle results. Even technical solutions, such as the introduction of brass-cased ammunition in March 1945, which resolved earlier problems with moisture sensitivity, arrived too late to influence the decisive phases of the war. By that point, the outcome of the Pacific campaigns had largely been determined by coordinated combined arms operations, overwhelming firepower, and naval dominance rather than by small unit shotgun actions. The absence of a specific Japanese counter-strategy against shotguns, therefore, reflects a reasonable assessment of their limited battlefield role rather than a critical oversight. In sum, the narrative surrounding shotguns in the Pacific War often tells us more about wartime mythology than it does about actual combat dynamics. They were present, occasionally useful, and sometimes feared at the tactical edge, but they did not fundamentally alter the trajectory of engagements or campaigns. Their story is instructive in highlighting the gap between technological potential and operational reality, and in demonstrating that battlefield success relies on comprehensive integration of weapons into doctrine, training, and strategy, rather than on individual hardware alone. During World War II, military planners prioritized countering the weapons that truly dictated the outcome of battles, including artillery, naval gunfire, aircraft, and flamethrowers. While shotguns theoretically offered an advantage at close range, in practice they did not generate enough tactical effect to justify specialized countermeasures. In the modern military, shotguns remain in limited use, mainly for breaching operations, deployment of non-lethal ammunition, and other narrowly defined close-quarters tasks. This restricted application closely mirrors their actual deployment in the Pacific Theater, rather than the exaggerated accounts popularized in books and films. The image of Marines sweeping Japanese positions with shotguns, although vivid, is more reflective of cultural storytelling than of operational reality. Such narratives emphasize American ingenuity, practical problem-solving, and adaptability under fire, but they do not correspond to the historical record. Historical evidence shows that while shotguns were issued and occasionally effective, their contribution to overall combat outcomes was minor compared to the decisive impact of larger-scale weapon systems. Japanese troops may have been startled by the presence of 12-gauge shotguns during assault, yet this surprise had little influence on the broader course of battles. Outcomes were overwhelmingly determined by American industrial capacity, logistical efficiency, and the integrated use of infantry, armor, artillery, and naval forces. In other words, the shock value of a shotgun blast in dense jungle was largely symbolic rather than strategically consequential. Detailed examination of primary sources, veteran reports, and official military documentation reveals that shotguns were primarily secondary tools. They were constrained by ammunition shortages until late in the war, and their operational use was typically confined to specific scenarios rather than widespread combat. While the stories of close-range shotgun encounters resonate in popular memory, the actual historical significance of these weapons is far more limited. Ultimately, the enduring legend of the American shotgun in the Pacific conflict demonstrates the gap between myth and reality in military history. These firearms attained cultural prominence that far exceeded their tactical effect, serving as symbols of American resourcefulness and firepower. The exaggerated reputation of shotguns underscores a broader tendency in popular accounts to prioritize dramatic moments over nuanced historical accuracy. In the Pacific Campaign, the weapons that truly determined Japanese defeats were the overwhelming logistical support, superior industrial output, coordinated multi-branch operations, and relentless naval dominance. Shotguns, though occasionally employed, were secondary contributors to these decisive factors. In summary, understanding the actual function of shotguns in the Pacific War requires separating verifiable historical fact from the layers of mythology that have built up over decades. Their presence on the battlefield provides insight not only into combat practices, but also into the ways wartime narratives evolve, highlighting the interplay between tangible military capability and the stories that societies tell about their own forces.